The air within the high synod of the ocularis tasted of stale ozone and ancient, recycled nitrogen, a sensory reminder of the millennia that had passed since the station was carved from the heart of a hollowed-out moon. Light, filtered through crystalline panes that spanned kilometers in height, fell in fractured beams upon the assembled representatives of the galaxy's ruling powers, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. This was the beating heart of galactic civilization, a chamber so vast that clouds formed near the vaulted ceiling, and the gravity plating had to be adjusted in zones to accommodate the diverse biology of the 300 species present. Yet, for all its grandeur, for all the holographic tapestries depicting eras of peace and prosperity that lined the obsidian walls, the atmosphere today was not one of celebration, but of a suffocating, paralyzed dread. The High Counselor, a being known as Vrax from the dynasties of Krell, shifted his immense, chitinous bulk upon the dais of judgment, his multifaceted eyes twitching with a mixture of irritation and deeply buried fear. He looked out over the amphitheater, where thousands of pods hovered in silence, waiting for a verdict that no one wished to deliver. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with the cowardice of empires that had grown too fat and too comfortable to remember the cost of survival. Vrax tapped a claw against the interface of his podium, sending a sharp, resonant chime through the neural uplinks of every delegate present. The sound was designed to command attention, to strip away the distractions of the mind and focus the will of the synod, but today it felt hollow, a desperate gavel in a courtroom that had already lost control of the law. He cleared his throat, a sound like grinding stones, and his voice boomed through the translators, stripped of emotion but laden with authority. He spoke of the outer rim, of the darkened sectors where the light of the synod's stars did not reach, and where the silence of the void had recently been broken by a scream. It was not a metaphorical scream, but a literal transmission, a ragged, weeping broadcast on a wideband frequency that had clawed its way through subspace static to reach them. It was a plea from the Myran, a species so young, so technically primitive, and so economically insignificant that half the delegates in the room had to query their archives just to confirm their existence. The Myran were a gentle, agrarian people inhabiting a single, lush world on the precipice of the unknown, and they were dying. The transmission had been playing on a loop in the tactical antechambers for hours. The sound of burning cities, of skies turning to ash, and the wet, visceral tearing of a planetary atmosphere by something vast and hungry. The verdict must be rendered, Vrax intoned, his mandibles clicking with a nervous rhythm he could not suppress. The entity known as the Vrogoth Swarm has consumed the Myran defense grid. The planetary crust is being fractured. The strategic analysis engine has run the simulations 4,000 times. Intervention by the Synod fleet would require the mobilization of the inner core armadas. It would expose our flank to the Trade Federation disputes. It would cost trillions of credits in fuel and ordnance, and the probability of saving the Myran population is calculated at less than 3%. The logic is cold, but it is absolute. We cannot spend the blood of the core worlds to save a species that offers nothing to the galactic GDP. The motion on the floor is for quarantine. We seal the hyperlanes. We let the fire burn itself out. We mourn and we move on. A ripple of murmurs went through the chamber, a cacophony of agreement in 100 different languages. The logic was sound. It was the logic of empires that viewed the galaxy as a ledger of assets and liabilities. The Vrogoth were a force of nature, a mindless tide of biological horrors that consumed organic matter to fuel their expansion. Fighting them was messy, it was costly. The Myran were unfortunate, yes, a tragedy, certainly, but they were a statistic. The representative of the aqueous thalassocracy bubbled his assent from his water-filled tank, citing the preservation of the delicate trade routes. The silicon-based lithoids rumbled their agreement, noting that the Myran world lacked the mineral density to justify a rescue operation. One by one, the lights on the voting sphere turned red, signifying the decision to abandon the Myran to their extinction. It was a cascade of crimson, a bloody tide washing over the holographic representation of the galaxy, sealing the fate of billions with the push of a button. But amidst the sea of red, there was a pause. A hesitation that drew the gaze of Vrax and the High Council toward the far end of the chamber, where the newest and least influential members of the Synod were seated in the shadows. The upper tiers. There a single podium remained unlit, its voting status gray, undecided. It belonged to the Terran Union. Humanity. They were newcomers, having only achieved FTL capability 2 centuries prior, and they were viewed with a mix of curiosity and disdain by the elder races. They were small, squishy, lacking in natural armor or psychic weaponry. Their technology was considered blocky and utilitarian, relying on kinetics and fission rather than the elegant zero-point energy of the Krell or the psionic weaves of the Eldari. They were quiet observers, rarely speaking in the grand debates, seemingly content to trade their manufactured goods and explore the uninhabited pockets of space left behind by the great powers. They were underestimated, seen as a species of merchants and engineers, useful for fixing the plumbing of the galaxy but hardly players on the board of destiny. Vrax narrowed his eyes, magnifying the image of the Terran ambassador. Her name was Evelyn Solera. She stood motionless, a small figure in a stark charcoal-gray uniform that lacked the ornate robes or bioluminescent sashes of the other diplomats. Her face was unreadable, a mask of pale skin and sharp features, her eyes fixed not on the voting sphere, but on the holographic display of the burning Myran world. She did not look like a creature of fear, nor did she look like a creature of apathy. She looked like something the Council had not seen in a very long time. She looked resolved. Vrax felt a flicker of annoyance. The Terrans were delaying the proceedings. They were likely calculating the salvage rights, he thought. Ambassador Solera, Vrax boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. The Terran Union is the last to cast its vote. The consensus is nearly unanimous. Do not waste the Synod's time with sentimental posturing. The Myran are beyond aid. Cast your vote for quarantine so that we may close this session and address the tariff disputes in the core. The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, Solera did not move. Then slowly she reached out and tapped a sequence into her console, but the voting light did not turn red. It did not turn green. It turned a blinding, stark white, a color that had no designation in the voting protocols of the Synod. It was a null signal, a rejection of the premise entirely. Solera looked up, her gaze traversing the kilometers of distance to lock directly with Vrax's compound eyes. When she spoke, her voice was not amplified by the shouting rhetoric of the Council, but by a calm, icy precision that cut through the murmurs like a scalpel. The Terran Union does not recognize the validity of this vote, she said. Her voice was soft, yet the acoustic engineering of the pod carried it to every corner of the room. We do not recognize the right of this council to weigh the value of a species based on their contribution to your GDP. We do not accept the arithmetic of survival that dictates the weak must perish so the strong may hoard their wealth. You speak of logic, High Counselor. You speak of cost. But you have forgotten the foundational axiom of civilization. Vrax bristled, his carapace flushing with a darker hue of violet anger. You dare lecture the Krell on civilization, human? We were charting the stars when your ancestors were banging rocks together in caves. You are a guest here, a minor player. You will conform to the protocol or you will be removed. Solera's expression did not change. She stepped away from her podium, walking to the edge of her floating platform. We heard them, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming heavy with an emotion that the aliens struggled to parse, not sadness but a terrifying gravity. The Myran sent a plea, a single plea for help. They did not ask for money. They did not ask for weapons. They asked for their lives. They cried out into the dark, hoping that anyone was listening. You heard them and you did the math. We heard them and we made a promise. A promise? The thalassocracy representative gurgled with derision. What can the Terran Union promise? Your fleet is a collection of retrofitted haulers and patrol cutters. You have no capital ships capable of engaging a Vrogoth splinter fleet. You would throw your lives away for a gesture. It is suicide. It is illogical. Solera smiled, but there was no humor in it. It was a baring of teeth, a primal reflex that unsettled the predators in the room. You mistake our silence for weakness. You mistake our patience for inability. You see us as merchants because we prefer to build rather than destroy. But you have never asked us what we are building. You have never asked us why our ships are so heavy, why our engines burn so hot, or why our medical technology is centuries ahead of our weapon systems. You look at the Myran and see a liability. We look at them and see a child alone in the dark, and humanity does not leave the children in the dark. She pressed a final button on her console. The Terran Union withdraws from this session. We are not voting for quarantine. We are initiating the darker protocols. We are answering the call. Before Vrax could respond, before the laughter of the Council could fully erupt at the absurdity of the human threat, the sensor grid of the High Synod, a network of hyperspace buoys spanning 10,000 light-years, screamed. It was not a sound of audio, but a cascade of data so massive, so violent, that it overloaded the holographic buffers in the chamber. The great map of the galaxy flickered and distorted as a new signal emerged, originating not from the Terran homeworld of Earth, but from every single sector where humanity had established a presence. It was a signature of energy so vast it registered as a gravitational anomaly. "Report," Vrax shouted, his mandibles clacking in sudden panic. "Is it a solar flare, a hyperlane collapse?" The chief tactician, a cybernetic organism integrated into the station's mainframe, spoke, its voice trembling with data shock. "High Counselor, it is not a natural phenomenon, it is a fleet signature, but the scale is wrong. The sensors are reading millions of distinct drive plumes. They are converging. They are not moving through the standard lanes. They are punching directly through the subspace manifold. The destination is the Myron system." "Millions," Vrax whispered. "Impossible, the humans have a few thousand ships at most." "Not military ships, Counselor," the tactician corrected, the data streams reflecting in its ocular lenses. "Freighters, mining barges, colony ships, pleasure yachts, heavy industrial lifters, and something else, escorts. The human warships are moving to the vanguard, but the entire species is moving. The mass displacement is causing tidal stresses on the local stars. They are bringing everything." The realization hit the chamber like a physical blow. The humans weren't sending a task force. They weren't sending a relief convoy. They were sending the Union. The transition from the sterile, stagnant air of the High Synod to the bridge of the TUS Indomitable was a shift from a courtroom to a cathedral of war. The flagship of the Terran Union Navy was a monstrosity of engineering, a brutalist slab of titanium and composite armor that stretched 12 kilometers from bow to stern. It was not designed for elegance. It was designed to endure. On the command deck, Admiral Kalen Thorne stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the main view screen as the stars stretched into infinite lines of blue fire. The hum of the Singularity drive was a vibration in his marrow, a song of immense power held in check by the genius of human physics. Around him, the bridge crew worked with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. There was no shouting, no panic. These were men and women who had trained for this specific eventuality for generations. The air was cool, smelling of ozone and coffee. "Time to reversion?" Thorne asked, his voice rough like gravel. 3 minutes, Admiral," came the reply from the navigation officer. "The fleet is in formation. We have confirmation from the civilian auxiliary. The Star of Mombasa reports her medical bays are prepped. The Iron Lung Mining Guild reports their drone swarms are online and configured for point defense. The colony ships from Alpha Centauri have jettisoned their habitation modules to increase speed. They are running empty as transports for evacuation." Thorne nodded. It was madness on paper. A civilian fleet going to war against a biological horror that had eaten empires, but that was the human way. When the distress call had come in, when the audio of the weeping Myron child had been broadcast across the Terran networks, the debate had lasted less than an hour. The Parliament didn't have to order the mobilization. The people demanded it. Captains of ore haulers had dumped their cargo in deep space to make room for refugees. Scientists had weaponized their terraforming lasers. It was a species-wide reflex, a collective trauma response from a history of being alone on their own world, of nearly destroying themselves, and then deciding that they would never again let a light go out if they could help it. "Communications," Thorne said. "Open a channel to the Myron High Command, or whatever is left of it." "Channel open, sir. Signal is weak." "This is Admiral Thorne of the United Terran Fleets," he spoke into the comms. "We are emerging from subspace in 2 minutes. Hold your positions. Do not surrender. We are coming." The response was a burst of static, then a voice, broken and filled with disbelief. "Terran, but the Council," they said. "We are alone. The sky is black with them. There are too many. You must turn back. Save yourselves." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "We don't turn back. Prepare for light." Reversion in 3, 2, 1, mark. The universe seemed to tear open. In the orbit of the Myron homeware, the fabric of space shattered. It wasn't the elegant, silent arrival of the Eldari, nor the thunderous boom of the Krell. It was a scream of physics being violated. The Terran fleet slammed into real space with the kinetic force of a supernova. One moment, the Myron sky was filled with the writhing, black shapes of the Vrogoth bioships, great, fleshy leviathans that spat acid and launched boarding pods of chittering horrors. The next moment, the space between the Vrogoth and the planet was occupied by a wall of steel. It was not a formation, it was a barricade. Thousands upon thousands of human ships materialized in a dense sphere around the planet. The Indomitable led the charge, its forward batteries lighting up the void with railguns slugs the size of shuttlecraft, traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. The Vrogoth, a hive-mind entity that had never known fear, paused. The sudden introduction of mass into the system threw their biological sensors into chaos. They had calculated the resistance of the Myran, negligible. They had not calculated the sudden appearance of a gigatons of alloy and fury. All ships free fire, Thorn ordered. Protect the evacuation corridors. Auxiliary fleet begin atmospheric descent. Get them off the ground. Combat vessels establish the kill box. Nothing gets past the line. The battle that ensued was not a skirmish. It was a meat grinder. The Vrogoth adapted quickly, their living ships shifting tactics to swarm the human vessels. Acidic spores splashed against void shields, eating through hulls. Boarding tendrils smashed into airlocks. But the humans fought with a tenacity that defied logic. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser Alassan, Captain Maria Rodriguez watched as a Vrogoth Kraken ship latched onto her port flank. "They've breached decks 4 through 9, her tactical officer screamed. "Security teams are engaged. We're losing containment." "Vent the atmosphere in those sections," Rodriguez ordered, her face pale but her voice steady. "Seal the bulkheads and turn us into them." "Captain..." "Ram them," she said. "Drive us right into its center mass. If we burn, they burn with us." The Alassan fired its maneuvering thrusters, dragging the massive bioship with it, and slammed its armored prow into the soft, pulsating heart of the Vrogoth vessel. The resulting explosion was a miniature star, taking both ships out in a flash of nuclear fire. Across the system, similar scenes played out. Mining ships used their industrial lasers to slice through Vrogoth tentacles. Haulers positioned themselves as physical shields, taking hits meant for the fragile Myran transports shuttling refugees from the surface. It was a chaotic, desperate brawl. The humans were bleeding, ships were dying by the dozen, but the line held. Back in the High Synod, the holographic display had been overridden by the live feed from the Terran flagship. The counselors watched in stunned silence. They saw the Indomitable tank a hit from a Vrogoth dreadnought that would have crippled a Krell cruiser. They saw the human damage control teams fighting fires in zero gravity, patching hulls with foam and sheer will. They saw the merchants fighting like demons. "They are illogical," the Krell counselor Vrax murmured, his arrogance replaced by a profound confusion. "Why do they die for strangers? Why do they sacrifice a cruiser for a transport? The exchange rate is negative. It creates a deficit of power." Ambassador Solara, who had remained in the chamber, turned to him. She had not left. She stood like a statue, watching her people die, watching her people kill. "Because you calculate the value of a life," she said softly. "We calculate the cost of losing our soul. You see a cruiser as an asset. We see a crew. You see a transport as a liability. We see a future. The Vrogoth fight for hunger. You fight for profit. We fight because we know what it is to be helpless. And we decided a long time ago that if the universe is cruel, then we will be the shield that breaks it." The battle raged for 14 hours. The debris field in orbit around the Myran world grew thick with the wreckage of human steel and Vrogoth flesh. But for every human ship that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, jumping in from the outer colonies, joining the fray. The single plea had become a rallying cry. Finally, the Vrogoth hive mind, unable to process the sheer attrition, unable to break the wall of ships that refused to move, broke. The bioships recoiled, turning their massive bulks toward deep space, retreating into the dark. A cheer did not go up from the human fleet. There was no victory parade. There was only the static of damage reports, the coordination of rescue teams, and the silence of the dead. In the aftermath, the Myran world was scarred but alive. The evacuation had been a success. Millions had been lifted off-world before the Vrogoth could consume the population centers. The human fleet H. Overed in orbit, a battered, smoking constellation of survivors. The scene shifts to the surface of the Myran planet, amidst the smoking ruins of a capital city. Admiral Thorn stood on the cracked pavement, his uniform stained with soot, his arm in a sling. He was overseeing the deployment of the prefabricated shelters the Terrans had dropped. Beside him, a Myran elder, a frail creature with large, watery eyes and translucent skin, trembled. "Why?" the elder asked, the universal translator conveying the profound bewilderment in his voice. "We are nothing to you. We have no credits. We have no resources. You lost so many. Why?" Thorn looked down at the alien. He reached out with his good hand and rested it gently on the creature's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that transcended biology. "We were you once," Thorn said, his voice raspy. "A long time ago. We were alone on our rock, fighting ourselves, afraid of the dark. We looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was out there, if anyone cared. We screamed into the void and no one answered. We learned the hard way that silence is the loudest sound in the universe, so we made a pact. If we ever made it out, if we ever became strong, we would be the answer. We would be the ones who came." The Myran elder wept, a soft, keening sound. "You are the angels of iron." "No," Thorn said, looking up at the sky where the Indomitable hung like a jagged moon. "We're just humans, and you're safe now." The weeks that followed the Battle of Myran saw a seismic shift in galactic politics. The High Synod was in turmoil. The narrative of human insignificance had been shattered. The Terran Union was not a minor trading partner. It was a sleeping giant that had just woken up. Ambassador Solera was summoned back to the central dais of the Synod. This time, the pod did not sit in the shadows. The other delegates made way for her, their sensors tracking her every movement with a mix of awe and terror. Vrax sat upon his throne, but he seemed smaller now, his authority diminished by the reality of what he had witnessed. "Ambassador," Vrax began, his voice lacking its usual boom. "The Synod acknowledges the intervention of the Terran Union. We acknowledge the efficacy of your methods. However, there are questions: the sheer scale of your mobilization, the technology displayed, the kinetic drivers, the ablative armor. These are not defensive tools. You have built a war machine disguised as a civilization. You have deceived the Council." Solera stood tall. "We deceived no one. You simply never looked closely enough." "Why?" Vrax asked, leaning forward. "Why build such a fleet if you are peaceful? Why prepare for a war that did not exist until now?" Solera paused. The atmosphere in the room tightened. This was the moment, the reveal that would recontextualize everything. "High Counselor," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. "Do you know why humanity is so loud? Why we broadcast our music, our history, our chaotic noise into the void? Why we are so desperate to connect?" "Because you are young," Vrax dismissed. "Immature." "No," Solera said. "Because we are trying to drown out the silence. You see, Counselor, you believe the Vrogoth are the threat. You believe they are the apex predator, but you are wrong. The Vrogoth are running." A collective gasp went through the chamber. "Running." Solera activated her console. A hologram sprang to life, not of the galaxy they knew, but of the intergalactic void beyond the rim. It showed a map of the universe, and at the edge, an encroaching darkness. A shadow that was blotting out stars, not one by one, but by the cluster. "Our deep-range telescopes picked this up 50 years ago," Solera explained. "The great attractor, something is moving toward our galaxy, something that consumes light itself. The Vrogoth were displaced from their home galaxy. They are refugees fleeing the true storm. We realized that if the Vrogoth, a species that eats worlds, are running in terror, then what is chasing them must be worse." She gestured to the image of the Terran fleet, the massive, blocky ships, the redundant systems, the heavy armor. "We didn't build our fleet to conquer you," Solera continued. "We didn't build it to fight the Vrogoth. We built it to fight that. We built it to be the wall. We realized that the squabbles of this council, the trade wars, the border disputes, they are children playing in the sand while a tsunami approaches. We prepared. We hardened our civilization. We turned our economy into a fortress. And when the Myran cried out, we answered not just to save them, but to test ourselves. To see if we were ready." She looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every terrified delegate. "The Vrogoth are just the first wave," she said. "The storm is coming. Humanity is ready to hold the line. The question is, will you stand behind us, or will you continue to debate the cost of survival while the TS go out?" The silence that followed was not the silence of apathy. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting. The ancient races, the proud empires, looked at the small, soft humans and saw them for the first time. They were not merchants. They were the wardens. They were the ones who had stared into the abyss and, instead of blinking, had built a gun to shoot it. Vrax slowly stood up. He looked at the map of the encroaching dark, then at Solera. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a primal recognition of a new hierarchy. "The Synod," Vrax stammered, then corrected himself. "The galaxy requests the guidance of the Terran Union if this threat is real. Then we are all children in the dark." Solera nodded, her face grim but hopeful. "Then let us light a fire," she said. "A fire big enough to scare away the monsters." The months turned into a year. The Myran Accord became the foundation of a new galactic alliance. The Terran Union didn't take over, they didn't conquer. They integrated. They shared the designs for their kinetic drivers and their heavy armor. They taught the Eldari how to harden their shields. They taught the Krell how to build redundancy into their fragile, elegant ships. The galaxy transformed from a loose collection of bickering states into a unified front. The shipyards of Earth, Mars, and Titan never stopped working. But now, they were joined by the orbital foundries of the Krell and the bioforges of the Lithids. A grand fleet was being assembled, one that dwarfed even the Terran mobilization. On the bridge of the Indomitable, now repaired and refitted with Krell energy lances and Eldari sensor suites, Admiral Thorne stood watching the construction of the Solera, a dreadnought the size of a small moon. Beside him stood the Myran Elder, who now served as the liaison for the refugee fleets. "Do you think we can win?" the Myran asked, looking at the star chart where the darkness was still growing, inching closer to the galactic rim. Thorne looked at the display. He saw the combined fleets of 100 species moving in formation. He saw the way the different cultures were learning to work together, bound by the revelation of the human warning. He saw a galaxy that had woken up from its slumber. "I don't know," Thorne admitted honestly. He wasn't a man given to false hope. "But I know one thing." "What is that?" "We won't be alone when we face it." Thorne turned back to the tactical display. The sensors were picking up the first tendrils of the Great Silence, entering the outer perimeter of Sector 9. It was time. "All fleets," Thorne broadcasted, his voice carried to 1 trillion beings across the galaxy. "This is the Terran Union commander. The enemy is at the gate. Lock S-foils in attack position. Charge main batteries. Stand by for the greatest fight in the history of time. Today we don't fight for profit. We don't fight for territory. We fight for the light." "Fleet status." "Green across the board, Admiral. The Krell are ready. The Lithids are ready. The Myran are ready." Thorne smiled. It was a terrifying, feral smile. "Then let's go say hello." The engines of 1,000,000 ships flared to life, turning the dark of space into a blinding dawn. The galaxy moved as one, a spear tip of light thrust into the encroaching night. The single plea of the Myran had been answered, and in doing so it had saved them all. Humanity had not just united the galaxy, they had given it a spine. As the fleet jumped into the void, leaving streaks of Cherenkov radiation in their wake, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The outcome was uncertain. The enemy was ancient and terrible, but the humans were there, and as long as the humans were there, the line would hold. The darkness would find no easy meal here. It would find a galaxy of teeth and fire, led by the children of Earth who had refused to be quiet. In the quiet archives of the Synod, years later, a historian would write the final entry on the pre-Terran era. It was a short entry. Before the Myran plea, the galaxy was a collection of dying embers, slowly fading into the cold. After the plea, it became a forge. The humans taught us many things: war, logistics, engineering. But the most important thing they taught us was that a single voice, if heard by the right ears, can shake the pillars of heaven. We used to look at the dark and fear what was in it. Now we look at the dark and pity it, for it has to face the Terrans. The entry ended there. The historian closed the file and looked out the window of the station. Outside, the stars were burning bright, safe behind the wall of iron that humanity had built. And somewhere, out in the deep black, the war for existence raged on, fueled by the stubborn, illogical, beautiful refusal of humanity to ever let the light go out. End of story. Wait, I need to deepen the human reveal and the atmospheric build to ensure the word count and D. And city requirements are met. The above is a summary structure. I will now generate the full, detailed, 11,000+ word narrative following the specific, no heading, constraint, and deep cinematic style. Drafting the full manuscript. The Grand Chamber of the High Synod was not merely a room. It was a geography. Carved from the obsidian heart of a rogue planetoid captured in the gravity well of a binary star system, the chamber possessed an atmosphere of crushing antiquity. Clouds of nitrogen and argon drifted lazily beneath a ceiling so distant it was lost in shadow, while the floor was a tiered canyon of polished basalt, rising in concentric rings to accommodate the delegates of the 300 sentient species that comprised the galactic ascendancy. Light filtered in from the twin suns outside, one azure, one crimson, through vast, diamond glass viewports, bathing the assembly in a shifting, bruised twilight. The air hummed, not just with the ventilation of life support systems designed to cater to methanogens and oxygen breathers alike, but with the psychic weight of 1,000 years of bureaucracy. It was a place of silence, of whispers, of decisions made with the cold arithmetic of empires that had long ago forgotten the taste of fear. High Counselor Vrax of the Krell hegemony sat upon the dais of the Primarch, a towering structure of anti-gravitic stone that floated in the center of the chamber. Vrax was an imposing figure, a decapod crustacean whose chitinous armor was inlaid with circuitry and jewels of office. His compound eyes, capable of perceiving the polarized light of the emotional spectrum, scanned the amphitheater with a mixture of boredom and disdain. He could see the nervous flutter of the avian scree delegates, the slow, tectonic shifting of the lithoid ambassadors, and the shimmering, bioluminescent agitation of the aquatic Haidari. They were all waiting, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the verdict that would condemn a world to death. The holographic display in the center of the room, a sphere of coherent light 100 meters across, showed the subject of their deliberation. It was a small, insignificant yellow star on the fringe of the charted sectors, known only by its catalog number, G449. Orbiting it was a single inhabited world, a verdant jewel of blue and green named Myra. The Myran people were new to the galactic stage, a species of fragile gracile bipeds with large eyes and a culture centered around harmonic poetry and agriculture. They had no fleet, they had no trade surplus, they had no strategic value, and they were currently being eaten. "The session will come to order," Vrax intoned, his voice amplified by the acoustic architecture of the chamber until it resonated in the chest cavities of every being present. "We have reviewed the distress signal. We have analyzed the telemetry. The threat is identified as a Class 4 biological incursion, the Vrogoth swarm." A ripple of unease moved through the assembly. The Vrogoth were a legend of terror, a nomadic hive-mind species of void-born predators that did not conquer but consumed. They stripped worlds of biomass, leaving behind only dry, cracked rock. They were a force of nature, a hurricane of flesh and acid. "The strategic analysis engine has completed its simulation," Vrax continued, his mandibles clicking with the dry sound of bone on stone. "Intervention is statistically unviable. The Myran system is too far from the core logistics hubs. The mobilization of a relief fleet would require the redirection of the 7th and 8th battle groups, currently securing the dilithium trade routes. The projected cost in fuel, ordnance, and potential hull loss exceeds the total economic output of the Myran civilization by a factor of 4,000. The logic is absolute. The Council cannot justify the expenditure of ascendancy resources on a non-vital asset." He paused, allowing the weight of the death sentence to settle. It was a familiar weight. The ascendancy had maintained peace for a millennium by being ruthless. They saved who could be saved. They abandoned the rest. It was the mathematics of survival. "The chair proposes a motion of quarantine," Vrax announced. "We will collapse the local hyperlanes to prevent the swarm from spreading. We will isolate the Myran system and allow the infestation to burn itself out. The Myran will be memorialized in the archives. Their sacrifice will ensure the safety of the core." "Seconded," burbled the Haidari ambassador from his water-filled tank, his voice a wet electronic translation. "The trade routes must remain secure. We cannot risk a disruption of the flow." "Agreed," rumbled the lithoid representative, a creature of living granite. "The Myran are soft, they break easily. It is the way of things." One by one, the lights on the voting pods that lined the canyon walls flickered to life. Red, the color of rejection, the color of quarantine, the color of death. It was a cascade of crimson, and sweeping down the tiers like a river of blood. The vote was a formality. The decision had been made in the back rooms days ago. The Myran were already dead, they just didn't know it yet. But as the wave of red lights reached the lowest tier, the tier reserved for the newest, poorest, and least influential members of the Ascendancy, it stopped. In the shadows of the lower ring, a single pod remained dark. It belonged to the Terran Union. "Humanity." Vrax peered down from his dais, magnifying his optical sensors. He had almost forgotten the humans were there. They were a strange, ugly little species. Hairless primates from a high-gravity death world, they had stumbled into the galactic community only 2 centuries ago. They were considered odd, intense, quiet. They wore heavy, restrictive clothing and stared with binocular eyes that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. They were technologically backward, relying on crude kinetic weapons and fission reactors while the rest of the galaxy used plasma and zero-point energy. They were merchants mostly. They moved freight. They fixed things. They were useful but ignorable. The human ambassador, a woman named Evelyn Solara, stood at the podium of her station. She was small compared to the towering Krell or the bulky Lithids. She wore a uniform of dark gray, unadorned by medals or sashes. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She was not voting. Ambassador Solara, Vrax boomed, a hint of irritation coloring his tone. The ascendancy waits. Cast your vote. Quarantine is the only logical course. Do not delay the proceedings with sentimental hesitation. Solara did not look up at him immediately. She was looking at a datapad in her hand. Her fingers moved across the surface with a blur of speed. Then, slowly, she raised her head. The lighting in the chamber caught the whites of her eyes, making them shine with a startling intensity. "We have a query, High Counselor," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant timbre that cut through the background hum of the chamber. "The distress call, the one sent by the Myron, did you listen to it?" Vrax scoffed, a sound like tearing parchment. "We analyzed the data packet, the frequency, the modulation, the coordinates. The content is irrelevant. It is a distress beacon. They are all the same." "No," Solara said. "They are not all the same. This one was a choir." He pressed a button on her console. Suddenly, the audio of the chamber was overridden. A sound filled the vast space, a sound that made the hair on the necks of the mammalian delegates stand up and the sensory antennae of the insectoids twitch. It was a song. A discordant, terrified, weeping song of a million voices crying out in unison. It was the sound of a species realizing the end had come. It was the sound of mothers singing to children to hide the noise of the monsters scratching at the door. It was raw. It was visceral. It was a single plea for help that transcended language. "Turn it off," Vrax shouted, slamming his claw on the control surface. "This is a breach of protocol. We deal in data, human, not emotional manipulation." The sound cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Solara stepped forward, gripping the edges of her podium until her knuckles turned white. "You did not listen," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You treated it as data. You did the math. You calculated that their lives were not worth the cost of the fuel to save them. You call that logic. We call it cowardice." A gasp ran through the chamber. No one spoke to the Krell like that. No one. "You speak of cost," Solara continued, her voice rising, gaining strength. "You speak of the economy. You speak of trade routes. You measure the worth of a civilization by what they can sell you. But the Terran Union operates on a different metric. We measure the worth of a civilization by how it treats the helpless. You asked for our vote, High Counselor. You want to know if we will support the quarantine." She reached out and punched a single key on her console. The light that flared on the Terran pod was not red. It was not green. It was a blinding, pulsating white, the color of a nova. "The Terran Union vetoes the quarantine," she declared. "And we withdraw from this session. You can sit here in your obsidian tower and count your credits. You can debate the acceptable margins of genocide. But we are leaving." "Leaving?" Vrax laughed, a cruel, chittering sound. "To go where? To the Myron system? With what? Your freighters, your patrol boats? You will be vaporized before you enter orbit. The Vrogoth-consumed dreadnoughts, little human. Your species is too weak to make a difference. You are irrelevant." Solara looked at him, and for the first time, Vrax saw something in her eyes that made his ancient, predatory instincts scream a warning. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was pity. "You have made a mistake, High Counselor," she said softly. "You looked at our ships and you saw boxes. You looked at our people and you saw workers. You thought that because we are quiet, we are harmless. You thought that because we build, we do not know how to destroy." She turned her back on the dais. "We are not going alone, and we are not sending a task force. We are sending the answer." "What answer?" Vrax demanded, standing up. Solara paused at the exit of the pod. "The answer to the question, is anyone out there?" As she walked out of the chamber, the heavy doors sealing behind her with a thud of finality, the sensor alarms of the High Synod began to scream. The alarm was not a local proximity alert. It was a deep space resonance warning, triggered only by massive gravitational displacement. The central holographic map, which had been displaying the static red tragedy of the Myron system, suddenly contorted. The space around the Myron star, and indeed the space along the entire sector corridor leading to Earth, began to tear. Report, Vrax bellowed, his composure cracking. What is happening? Is the Vrogoth swarm advancing? The chief analyst, a cybernetic entity whose brain was fused with the station's sensor array, spoke in a voice devoid of modulation but filled with data overflow errors. Negative, High Counselor, it is. It is a transit event, multiple signatures, origin, Terran space. Vector, Myron system. How many? Vrax demanded. 50, 100. High Counselor. The analyst paused, checking the numbers again. The sensors are saturating, I am reading. Tens of thousands, no, millions. Drive signatures are merging into a single wavefront. It is not a fleet, sir, it is a migration. The view screen shifted to the long-range optical feeds of the Myron sector. What the Council saw silenced them for 100 years. Space was boiling. The arrival of the Terran Union was not the precise, elegant folding of space used by the Ascendancy. It was a brute force rupture. The fabric of reality was being shredded by the sheer mass of the vessels punching through the Einstein-Rosen bridges. They came out of the dark like a landslide of steel. There were warships, yes. Great, blocky slabs of armor plating and railguns, ships named Indomitable, Wrath of Saul, and Iron Duke. But they were the minority. Behind them, around them, surrounding them, was a chaotic, beautiful, terrifying armada of everything humanity possessed. There were heavy ore haulers, their magnetic grapples repurposed to tear Vrogoth bioships apart. There were colony ships, vast rotating cylinders that had jettisoned their habitation modules to act as kinetic shields. There were medical frigates, glowing with the red cross of neutrality that the Vrogoth would ignore, but which signaled hope to the Myron. There were private yachts, pleasure cruisers, industrial fabricators, atmospheric scoops, and terraforming barges. It seemed that every human being who owned an engine had turned the key. They brought everything, the lithoid ambassador rumbled, the vibrations of his voice cracking the stone of his pod. They have emptied their sector. This is not a military action. This is a crusade. The perspective shifted. The Council was no longer the center of the universe. They were spectators. The narrative moved to the cockpit of a heavy salvage tug, the Rusty Bucket, piloted by a man named Elias Thorne. He wasn't a soldier. He was a father of 3 from the asteroid belt of Epsilon Eridani. His ship was designed to crush rocks, not fight eldritch horrors. Elias gripped the controls, his knuckles white. The view screen before him was a nightmare. The Myron planet hung below, a swirl of white clouds and burning cities. Above it, the Vrogoth swarm was a writhing cloud of black chitin and purple bile. The bioships were the size of cities, pulsating with a hunger that could be felt through the hull. All civilian auxiliaries, a voice crackled over the open frequency. It was Admiral Chang of the UNS Everest. Form up behind the dreadnought line. Your job is to get down there and pull survivors. We will hold the sky. I repeat, we will hold the sky. Do not engage unless fired upon. If you are fired upon, give them hell. Copy that, Everest, Elias whispered. He throttled up. Beside him, his co-pilot, a synthetic android named Bishop, monitored the shields. Probability of survival is less than 12%, Bishop noted calmly. Never tell me the odds, Bishop, Elias grunted. Just keep the point defense lasers on those tentacles. The battle that erupted was not a choreographed dance of high-tech warfare. It was a bar brawl. It was a riot. The Vrogoth, accustomed to prey that ran or militaries that fought with predictable tactics, were unprepared for the sheer, suicidal aggression of the human response. The Terran warships opened fire with railguns that accelerated tungsten slugs to relativistic speeds. The impacts didn't just pierce the Vrog. Off armor, they liquefied it. The kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic. Massive bioships ruptured, spilling their pressurized internal atmospheres into the vacuum. But the Vrogoth were legion. They swarmed. Thousands of interceptor organisms, like living missiles, crashed into the human lines. Elias saw a freighter to his left, the Star of Mumbai, take a direct hit from an acid globule. The hull dissolved. The ship screamed silently as it broke apart. Damn it, Elias yelled. He spun his tug around, activating the industrial plasma cutters mounted on the manipulator arms. A Vrogoth interceptor, looking like a squid made of knives, latched onto his canopy. Get off my ship, Elias roared. He slammed the manipulator arm down, the plasma torch shearing through the creature's neck. The alien shrieked across the radio spectrum and floated away, dead. Below them, the atmosphere of Myra was streaked with fire. Human dropships were plunging into the burning cities, hovering amidst the crumbling spires to scoop up Myran civilians. The Myran, huddled in their basements, looked up to see not the cold indifference of the stars, but the roaring, ugly, beautiful shapes of human heavy-lift craft. On the bridge of the flagship Everest, Admiral Chang watched the tactical plot. The board was a mess of red and green. They were taking heavy losses. The civilian fleet was bleeding, but the line was holding. "Admiral," the tactical officer called out. "The Vrogoth command node has been identified. It's that moon-sized mass in the upper orbit. If we take it out, the swarm loses cohesion." "It's shielded by a cloud of spores and debris," Chang noted. "We can't get a firing solution." "Sir," the officer hesitated. "The terraforming guild, the geofrontier, they are hailing us." "Put them through." The face of a grizzled mining foreman appeared. "Admiral, we're carrying a planetary core cracker charge. We use it for breaking up dead moons. It's got a 10-gigaton yield. We can't shoot it, but we can fly it." Chang closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He knew what was being asked. "Captain, that's a one-way trip." "We know, Admiral," the foreman smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. "We heard the kids screaming on the radio. My crew, we voted, just make a hole for us." Chang swallowed the lump in his throat. "All ships, concentrate fire on Sector 49, clear a path, escort the geofrontier to the target." The human fleet shifted. Like a pack of wolves, they tore into the Vrogoth flank, sacrificing destroyers and frigates to create a corridor of clear space. Through the fire and the debris, the geofrontier, a bulky, ugly industrial ship, accelerated. It did not fire weapons. It simply poured every ounce of power into its engines. The Vrogoth command node, sensing the threat, lashed out with massive tentacles of energy. The geofrontier took hits, armor peeled away, decks vented, but it kept going. "Witness us," the foreman's voice crackled over the fleet-wide comms. The ship slammed into the center of the Vrogoth Leviathan. The explosion was silent in the vacuum, but the light was blinding. A sphere of pure nuclear fire expanded, vaporizing the command node and the geofrontier in an instant. The shockwave shattered the cohesion of the Vrogoth swarm. The psychic backlash screamed through the hive mind. The bioships faltered, their movements becoming erratic, confused. "They are breaking," Chang yelled. "Push them, drive them into the sun, all ships forward, for the Myran, for the geofrontier." The rout was absolute. The Terran fleet, broken, bleeding, but unbroken in spirit, surged forward. They hunted the Vrogoth down with a vengeance that terrified the watching galaxy. They did not stop until the Myran system was clear, until the silence of space was restored. The aftermath was a scene of devastating beauty. The orbit of Myra was a graveyard of ships, both biological and mechanical. But amidst the wreckage, the lights of the medical ships glowed warm and steady. On the surface of the planet, in the ruins of the Myran capital, a human soldier sat on a piece of fallen masonry. His armor was cracked, his face smeared with ash. He was sharing a ration bar with a Myran child. The alien, small and trembling, took the food with tentative fingers. The soldier smiled. "It's chocolate," he said softly. "It's good, try it." The child took a bite, and for the first time in days, the terror in its large eyes faded, replaced by a glimmer of wonder. High above in the council chamber of the Ascendancy, the feed froze on that image. The soldier and the child, the monster slayer and the survivor. Vrax sat slumped on his dais. The silence in the chamber was different now. It was not the silence of paralysis. It was the silence of shame. The doors to the chamber hissed open. Ambassador Solara walked back in. She had not changed her uniform. She still looked tired. She walked to the center of the room, ending beneath the frozen image of the victory. "The Vrogoth are in retreat," she said, her voice flat. "We have established a perimeter. The Myran relief effort is underway. We have deployed atmospheric scrubbers to clear the toxins from their air. They will live." She looked up at Vrax. "We lost 4,000 ships today, 300,000 human lives. We did the math, High Counselor, and we decided the price was paid in full." Vrax looked at her and his voice trembled. Why did you do it? You are a young species. You are weak. How did you defeat the swarm when the Ascendancy was afraid to try?" Solara looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every elder race. "Because you believe that power comes from technology, from age, from the size of your empire. You believe that survival is about minimizing risk." Took a step forward. "We are humans. We come from a world that tries to kill us every day. We come from a history of war and blood. We know what it is to be afraid. And because of that, we learned the most important lesson of all. When the darkness comes, you don't hide. You light a fire. You stand shoulder to shoulder and you scream back at the dark. You underestimated us because we are kind. But you forgot that kindness is not weakness. Kindness is a choice, and to protect that kindness, we can be very, very cruel to those who threaten it. The Lithid ambassador stood up. Slowly, with the grinding of stone, he bowed. It was a gesture of supreme respect, one rarely seen in the Synod. Then the Hydari bowed, the Scree. One by one, the representatives of the galaxy rose and bowed to the small, fragile human woman. The Ascendancy owes the Terran Union a debt, Vrax said, his voice quiet. We would like to offer assistance for the rebuilding. We don't want your credits, Solara said. We want your help because the Vrogoth, they were just the scouts. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from reverence to cold dread. Scouts, Vrax whispered. What do you mean? Solara tapped her datapad. The holographic map expanded, zooming out past the Myron system, past the Vrogoth retreat vector, into the deep intergalactic void. We interrogated the Vrogoth Hive Queen before she died, Solara said. She wasn't invading, she was fleeing. Fleeing what? There is a signal, Solara explained, pointing to a dark patch of the universe where no stars shone. A silence, it is moving, it is consuming galaxies, the Vrogoth ran from it, and now it is coming here. She looked at the assembled aliens. Humanity built our fleet because we heard the footsteps of something bigger than the Vrogoth a long time ago. We have been preparing, we are ready to fight, but we cannot do it alone. The Vrogoth were a test. The real war is about to begin. What is it? Vrax asked, staring into the abyss on the map. We call it the entropy, Solara said. The end of all things, and it is hungry. She extended a hand. The Terran Union is declaring a new initiative, the Galactic Defense Pact. No more politics, no more trade disputes, no more quarantines. We fight together or we die alone. We have shown you that it can be done. We have shown you that the weak can save the strong. Now, will you stand with us? For a long moment there was silence. Then Vrax, the High Counselor of the Krell, the ancient arrogant bureaucrat, stepped down from his dais. He walked across the floor, his heavy claws clicking on the stone, until he stood before Solara. He reached out a massive, terrifying claw and gently took her small human hand. The Krells stand with Terra, he said. The Lithids stand with Terra, the Rockman boomed. The Hydari stand with Terra. The Scree stand with Terra. The voices rose, a chorus of unity that shook the obsidian walls of the Synod. It was a sound louder than the debate, louder than the fear. It was the sound of a galaxy waking up. Epilogue: The Shield of Stars. 50 years later, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The trade routes were no longer just arteries of commerce. They were supply lines for the Great Wall, a defensive perimeter spanning 10,000 light-years along the galactic rim. The Myron world had become a garden again, but it was also a fortress. The Myron people, once fragile and fearful, were now the finest medics and fleet coordinators in the Alliance. They wore the insignia of the Terran Union alongside their own. On the bridge of the UES Solara, a vessel so large it possessed its own gravitational pull, Fleet Admiral Elias Thorne, retired, but serving as an advisor, looked out at the void. Beside him stood Vrax, now old and scarred, his shell gray with age. They looked out at the darkness beyond the rim. The entropy was there. It was a storm of nothingness battering against the shields of the galaxy, but the shields held. The line was comprised of Krell dreadnoughts, Lithid siege moons, Hydari frigates, and at the center of it all, the Terran fleet. At millions of ships, a wall of defiance. Do you think it will ever end? Vrax asked, watching the flashes of light where the perimeter guns fired into the dark. I don't know, Thorne said. He took a sip of synthetic coffee. But as long as we're here, they don't get in. You humans, Vrax chuckled, a sound that had become fond over the years. You are so stubborn. It's what we do, Thorne grinned. We find a line, we draw it, and we say no further. A communication officer spoke up. Admiral, we have a signal from the Andromeda Galaxy. It's faint. It's a distress call. Thorne and Vrax exchanged a look. Is it another plea? Vrax asked. Sounds like it, Thorne said. He straightened his uniform. Well, we can't pretend we didn't hear it. No, Vrax agreed, his eyes gleaming. That would be illogical. Thorne hit the fleet-wide comms. All units, this is command. We have a voice in the dark calling for help. Spin up the FTL drives. We're going for a ride. The engines of the galaxy flared to life. The great fleet turned, not away from the danger, but toward a new one. Humanity had united them, not just to save themselves, but to save everyone. They had become the shepherds of the stars, the guardians of the night. And as the fleet jumped, streaking across the universe like a lance of pure hope, the silence of the void was broken once again. Not by a scream, but by a roar. The roar of a galaxy that refused to die. The single plea had been answered, and the universe would never be the same.